Okay, well, good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Alan Castle, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the fourth of our agenda-building webinars for the inaugural Leadership Gathering on Complex Service Delivery, which we're now holding in May 2022. I'm grateful to be speaking to you from the territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, known today as the Esquimalt and Songhees Nations. I'd like to remind everyone that we're recording this video. Once it's been reviewed by our presenters, we will be posting it on the web. I'd also like to please ask your cooperation by having your camera off and being muted if you are not speaking. Obviously, if you're asking a question, you can turn them on. As with all of our discussions, we're focused on services to people with complex needs, particularly where the justice, health, and social sectors intersect. Today's event focuses on what is possible from a public sector perspective when working across different disciplines and service areas. We'll proceed through some very interesting presentations from our panel, and then we're going to open the floor for questions and discussion. Before I introduce our panelists and our facilitator, I'd like to invite Mark Miller, who's the Chief Executive of the John Howard Society Pacific, to welcome you all. Mark.
Hello, everyone. As Alan said, my name is Mark Miller. I'm the CEO with the John Howard Society Pacific. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that many of us are currently in different locations, and I would ask that each of us take a moment to reflect and acknowledge the Indigenous history of the land we are on today. I am acknowledging that I am currently on the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the tragic historical injustices that our First Nations people have experienced for generations and the intense grief that they are currently experiencing right now. I'm hopeful that conversations like this one can in some way contribute to all of us working together on a better future. I'll keep my words short, as I think we're all looking forward to hearing our speakers today. On behalf of our organization, I do want to welcome everyone that has taken the time to join us for what are very vital and timely conversations. I'd like to sincerely thank our participants today. We greatly appreciate the time that you're spending with us, and we feel very fortunate to have you share your knowledge and experience with us. I also want to thank our staff for their work on this initiative, and again, thank our advisory committee for their continued work and time commitment. I also want to thank Alan for his continuing work on this and supporting this initiative throughout it. And I will turn it back over to you at this point, Alan. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark. So today we're fortunate to be joined by four experts who geographically are about as far apart from each other and from us as it is possible to be. As we're doing this live, our presenters have also kindly agreed to join us far outside normal working hours, and this is something for which we're very grateful. So from the United Kingdom, we're joined by the Right Honourable Sir Norman Lamb, who was former Minister of Care in the Coalition Government from 2010 to 2015, and by Sophie Corlett. Sophie is the Director of External Relations at Mind. Mind is a mental health charity which provides advice and support to those experiencing mental health problems, as well as campaigning to improve services, raise awareness, and promote understanding. From Melbourne, in the beautiful state of Victoria, we are joined by our early risers, who both work for the Community Services Operations Support Group in the state government's Department of Families, Fairness and Housing. Shane Beaumont is the Manager of Complex Needs, and Catherine Glasgow is Principal Program Officer of Complex Needs. Facilitating our discussion today will be our colleague and good friend, Johnny Morris, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Mental Health Association's BC branch. And thank you, Johnny, for all your efforts in helping to bring this discussion about. And now I'm happy to turn the floor over to you, Johnny.
Thanks so much, Alan and Mark and team. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I also too am joining you from unceded ancestral Lekwungen-speaking territories, now known as the Esquimalt, Songhees, and WSÁNEĆ nations, and joining you as an uninvited settler from these lands this afternoon. We have such an exciting process ahead of you for the next 90 minutes or so. And just to give you a sense of the process, and then I'll share a little bit about the broader context, I'll just make some very brief remarks. So just to remind folks who've been around for these fantastic gatherings previously, we try and set the tone with content and material early on. So you're going to experience two 15-minute presentations or policy briefs from our colleagues. You're first going to hear from our team in Australia here. So you're going to hear from Shane and Catherine. They're going to share 50 minutes of material first. And then we're going to turn to the UK where you'll get to hear from Sir Norman Lamb and Sophie there about their work too. I have some questions, and so you're going to watch a facilitated dialogue for a few minutes, and then in keeping with our past work, we're going to open up the floor for people to either volunteer questions through the chat or to raise their hand and pose the question directly. So that's just a little bit of the process today. Quickly, we've gathered these speakers in this part of the trajectory of this webinar series to really focus on some key concepts and ideas. So much of what you're going to hear about this afternoon or this morning really focuses on collaboration and breaking down barriers and obstacles between sectors and silos and organizations. And so there's a running theme in the material that you'll hear from about the ways in which the actors you're going to meet shortly have found ways to collaborate meaningfully and sustainably in service of folks experiencing complex and ongoing needs, including mental health and substance use problems. We've brought these players together because these projects have had remarkable staying power in their jurisdictions. There's a legacy or an ongoing impetus to this work in bringing it about. And I know here in BC, there's an active and ongoing conversation and dialogue about how we get better at working together in service of clients and participants who access services at different points. So that's another key piece. And thinking here, particularly in the province that we're in, and thinking about currently the mandates that have been set out and the strategic priorities set out by government and other players, we anticipate that some of the learning, international learning for today's webinar will hold promise in realizing some of those mandate commitments collaboratively and together. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Shane Beaumont here to take it away alongside Catherine with a presentation on the MACNI initiative, which we'll learn about over the next 15 minutes or so. Over to you, Shane.
Thanks for that, Johnny. So I'd first like to start by acknowledging the lands which we meet on also today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today I'm coming from Melbourne, the land of the Wurundjeri people. So as we start, so in Melbourne, as they've introduced, Catherine and I both work for the state government. So the Victorian state government in the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing. And I think if we can go to the next slide, please, Alan. I just wanted to set the scene just so we're aware of sort of what size place we are, so everybody's on the same page. So Victoria, population of 6.5 million. I've put the Aboriginal population in there because I think there's a few things I want to talk about that as we go through. So Melbourne population, 5 million, quite a big city, 24,000 Aboriginal people. The Department of Human Service, or Department of Family, Fairness and Housing, operates in 17 geographical areas across the state. What I think is interesting for you guys will be that our government operates, so the government department that I work in operates mental health, alcohol and drugs, housing, disability, child protection. So we have a lot of the main policy and operations within our own department. Disability's changed a little bit in recent years. Up till 2016, disability was fully integrated in our department as well, but there was a federal program commenced in 2016 called the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which we've now pretty much fully transitioned over. So the state itself has very little responsibility for disability clients directly. A second department of the Victorian government is the Department of Justice and Community Safety. So we have fairly sort of strong links with them and lots of interactions with many of our clients crossing over with the justice system. Next slide, thanks, Alan. Just to give you a bit of history of where we've come from to get to where we got to today. So in the early 2000s, we did have a very much siloed approach. Although we were exactly the same as we are today, we were the one Victorian government department. There was lots of debate at the time as to, where did some of these complex clients belong to? Mental health would often say, no, don't have a treatable mental illness. Disability would say, no, not ours. We'd have discussions and debates around whether something was behavioural or whether it was a mental health presentation. So in the early 2000s, what happened? Government really had a number of events happen fairly quickly that caught media attention, and really that was what prompted us to have to do something about it. So as a Victorian government, there was a decision made to pool some money together and come up with a new approach to complex clients. And that came about with the introduction in 2004 of the Human Services Complex Needs Act. And really that's was really what gave us the authority, the legislative authority and power to do many things. The initial component of that, so from a governance point of view, I just want to talk through how that's gone. So initially it was set up with an independent person managing a statewide panel with members of different departments and programs coming together on a regular basis to consider clients, their eligibility for the program and funding. And that probably proceeded for several years. Then in 2007, there was really a number of internal reviews and evaluations of the program. And in 2009, new legislation was developed, or updated legislation was developed to address a number of the issues that were raised in the sort of early years. We then went to a single statewide panel chaired by department staff with really good attendance of all the program areas from within our department and from the Department of Justice. That went on through to about 2014, where we as a department decided it was time to go to geographically based services. So to be very clear that people should get services at their local geographical area and that they shouldn't have a bureaucratic central panel sort of overseeing it. So that was a move we made then. Next slide, please. So what is MACNI? So as I've said, MACNI has its legislation, the Human Services Complex Needs Act. In that act, there's one of those really strong points about it is the ability to share information outside of your traditional privacy sort of arrangements. So any service that has an interest in the client or could benefit the client is able to share information relevant to the client with other service providers. So that meant that child protection, mental health, drug and alcohol, hospitals, disability could all contribute and share information about that client to get a good picture of what was going on in their life. It is a voluntary program, so we can't compulsorily have people attend it. However, we have very few clients that ever say no to it, and some of that's around how you present the information to them. And the program is very much around assisting the client to meet their goals. We also utilise families for consent and involvement. And in some cases, we have legislation around formal guardians being appointed if the client doesn't have the capacity, whether it be through mental illness, disability, drug and alcohol, to be able to make decisions themselves. There is a guardianship process. Not used a lot, but in some cases it is. We have the service provision framework that was updated last in March 2020. That's our operational policy and guidelines. And what we do is we've nearly updated that every year since I've been involved from 2013. And that's effectively our ongoing quality control improvement process we have in place. As far as how the system works, there are 28 Department of Families and Fairness staff across the state that their role, so working in those 17 geographical areas, and their role is to do service system navigation for clients. So they are the initial contact point. Not only do we have formal MACNI, we have a consultation, assessment and pre-MACNI process, which is sort of really means anybody can come in the door, get some information, get diverted and referred on. We have detailed assessments, so we will pay for assessments for clients to get a better understanding of them. and then we may do pre-MACNI, which is sort of short, sharp, $15,000 intervention to try and divert away from formal MACNI. We have a strong assessment and care plan development period. So when MACNI is not crisis response, we take 12 weeks. So 20 hours a week for 12 weeks is allocated to the assessment and care plan development. So a lot of time and effort's put in to ensure we understand the client, get access to all past reports, and pull together a care plan that considers what's needed for the client and what does the client want. We're a care plan coordination service. We're not a case management service, and legislation allows us up to 36 months to provide this service. We have a formal review process every 6 months or every 3 months if needed through area-based complex needs panels, and they're a strong point in breaking down the silos, as those complex needs panels have a range of providers on them, and they involve transition planning. Funding, just so you know, so $7 million. We got a $2 million increase in 2018 as a result of an incident that occurred that led to sort of more publicity on complex clients in the community. Next slide, please, Alan. I'm not going to talk through this one. This is straight out of the legislation. So you can see that MACNI has very clear legislation as to what's covered, what isn't covered. The main thing that gives us flexibility here and means we haven't changed the legislation since 2009 is the word appears. So we don't have to have a mental illness within the meaning of the Mental Health Act. We have to appear to have it. So it gives you a little bit of leeway there. That's probably enough on that one. I think we'll move on to the next slide, please, Alan. So as I spoke before, 5 million people in Melbourne, 6.5 million in Victoria. We have 454 clients came to our service in the last 12 months. So that can be, they can walk through the door, seek information, through to 39 of them becoming formal MACNI clients. I put the Aboriginal numbers there just to really highlight that, as you can see, Aboriginal people are significantly overrepresented in this group, from really 1% of our population or so quite high. Lots of our clients, 39%, are under 25 years of age. And what I'd say with them, many of those clients have gone through the child protection system, the out-of-home care, youth justice, mental health services, and prisons. So it's sort of, there's a trajectory that, we can sort of see in some cases. A lot of people with mental illness, intellectual disability, acquired brain injury. The NDIS program's a bit more interesting now with us. As I said before, 2016 commenced the transition, fully transitioned now, with therefore any disability clients that would have previously got referred to us by our internal clients, disability client services, are now pretty much referred by the national program. We have very much a common approach with our clients in the justice system. So many of our clients are involved in the justice system, as I said. 10% of our 454 or so come through to formal MACNI. And that's really because of the work we've done in the consultation, assessment and pre-MACNI work. So we've spent a lot of time, that $2 million we got a couple of years ago, additional funds, really focused on working in consultation processes with clients that may or may not have met our criteria. We have data on where our referrals come from, and that's the bottom slide there. So once again, you can sort of see we get a fair few clients coming through different agencies. Next slide, please, Alan. One of the important things in reducing the silos, I think, across the different service providers. So although we're one government department, the silos still exist. So it is that thing around all the reviews we've done over the years have all suggested that communication and access are ongoing issues. So what we've done is we've set up these complex needs panels within regions or in our 17 geographical areas. We have the most senior department staff member chair complex needs panels. We have membership from all the relevant areas. So all the areas we think would have an intersection with these clients, we ensure that they're at this panel. So mental health, drug and alcohol justice, corrections, homelessness, child protection, disability. For Aboriginal people, we get our Aboriginal liaison people to attend that. And we also try and bring in different cultural groups if required, if we've got people coming from different cultural backgrounds. To ensure some sort of level of consistency, we also have Catherine and I attend all these panels as well. So these panels are generally monthly, run for 2 to 3 hours each. So a fair bit of our time goes into that. We've got fairly good details of what the role of the panel is, but it really is about what's happening with the client, what are the systemic issues, what can we do, have we tried all the generic services, is there anything else we can do differently, and is the proposed approach we're looking at through a MACNI response appropriate? Those panels are there to approve eligibility, approve the care plan, and to monitor that care plan at 3 or 6 monthly intervals. Next slide, please. We're forever in a changing environment, and we have many ongoing and emerging issues. But you know, these emerging issues are really opportunities for us. So you know, access to secure and appropriate housing is an ongoing issue, always has been. We know that without having somebody in a secure location, it's very difficult to provide the wraparound services. One of the things that's probably coming out more now is that the service system out there is good at coping with the generic clients, whether they're mental health, disability, alcohol and drugs. But once they get to be a multiple and complex client, so many different intersections, the service sector's a bit lacking, I suppose. We try to develop that sector, but I think that, you know, when you come down to the National Disability Insurance Scheme, it's a scheme that funds at set hourly rates for different levels of support. And what we're finding, there's a bit of a problem here in that the service system, if you've got the choice of picking up a client that's pretty straightforward and getting paid $60 an hour to support them versus a very complex client, and you're still getting $60 an hour, people are shying away. So some of our more difficult to engage with clients, we have trouble attracting service providers to work with them. So that's an ongoing problem for us. As I've said, the funding becomes a bit of an issue, and MACNI gets asked to fund the gap funding sometimes, like between the hourly rate that the national scheme will pay versus the rate that an organisation's willing to work for. We also have many royal commissions here in Victoria, and I think one of the really good things about royal commissions in Victoria are the Victorian government nearly always accepts 100% of the recommendations. So we've got a disability one at the moment. We've just had a mental health one complete, and the mental health ones certainly led to a massive injection of government funds into the mental health service system over the next 10 years. So as I say, you know, our challenges are also opportunities for us. So one of the things with the Royal Commission is we knew it was coming. We knew some of the issues. So it's about positioning yourself to be ready for some good ideas that you've potentially got. I've got the Aboriginal cultural safety there listed as well. It's not an emerging issue, it's an ongoing issue, and we continue to work to try and improve our access for people with Aboriginal people to services that are appropriate for them, that are culturally aware. And in MACNI space, we're sort of moving that way. So all our programs are expected to sort of be more considerate of Aboriginal people and how they work with them. Next slide, thanks. So really, that's it for my presentation of this morning. And I think I'll hand back to you now, Johnny. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Shane, for that presentation, that 50-minute kind of burst into Mackley and so many of those key issues and key ideas of the drivers of that de-siloing of that work, and whether it be a legislative driver, a funding driver, and I'm sure your material will lead to some great questions later on. So thanks so much for bringing the perspective from the Victorian government there, from yourself and Catherine. Thank you so much. We're going to switch gears to our second presentation team here for another 50 minutes or so of information. We have Sir Norman Lamb here and Sophie Corlett, who are going to be presenting on the crisis care Concordat that was implemented in the United Kingdom several years ago. So over to you, Norman and Sophie.
Well, thank you very much, Johnny. And I think it's probably fair to say that Sophie and I are both rather thrilled to be with you. This is our evening in England at the moment, because I think this is a programme that we're both actually rather proud of, because we managed back in 2014-15 to build quite a remarkable momentum and something of a social movement for change in setting standards for crisis mental health and for improving the coordination between services, particularly police and mental health services, in a way that simply had not been the case before that. By way of just explaining the background to this, it was very clear before we embarked on this journey that the state of crisis mental health care was pretty awful in our country. I remember meeting with Frank Bruno, the former world heavyweight boxing champion, who had gone through his own mental health crisis. And he described to me how 2 or 3 marked police cars had turned up at his house and dragged him out of his house and taken him off in these marked police cars. And he described how he felt ashamed, that he felt that his neighbours would assume that he'd committed some awful crime, whereas actually he was ill. And this was no way actually to treat someone who was ill. We also had a massive problem of people in the middle of a mental health crisis being placed in police cells, for goodness sake, as a so-called place of safety. And this was permitted under the legislation. Over 6,000 people a year back in 2013-14, wholly unacceptable in my view. And there were a number of reports that had come out, including from Sophie's organisation Mind, which is rather akin to the Canadian Mental Health Association. And in 2012, a survey had come out which showed that just 14% of people took the view that they'd experienced good crisis mental health care. So there was clearly a massive problem. And I, as minister at that time, felt that we needed to act. And so one of the powers that you have as a minister in a government is the power of convening people, bringing people to solve problems. And we brought, I remember in one particular meeting, which I think Sophie attended, we brought all of the key people nationally together to talk about what we could do to solve this wholly unacceptable situation. And I remember I proposed that we should try to draft a document which sets the standards of crisis mental health care very clearly, and which then we should all try to agree to by creating what we called a Concordat, with all of the key national organisations signing up to it. Now, people in that meeting agreed that this was a good idea and that it was worth trying. We set a timetable, this was back in, I think, 2013, to get the document drafted. We had a number of problems within the department because one of the interesting aspects of the lack of parity of esteem, as we call it, the lack of equality between physical and mental health care, is that the quality of the people working in mental health care in the department were not, frankly, as good as they should have been. And it was a regarded as a bit of a backwater in the department. And, the document wasn't drafted on time as it should have been. And I had to be quite firm that this was necessary. We had to do this. Thankfully, there was a brilliant guy, a guy called John Rouse, who was a director general, sort of second tier in the Department of Health, who took control of it and worked with Sophie and many others to get the document drafted. And one of the particular things that Sophie and her organisation insisted on was that the document should start with what we call I statements, what I, as someone in a mental health crisis, should expect from the system when I face that crisis, so that it becomes very personal rather than just a sort of system response to a problem. And it set out some very clear expectations as to what people should expect. So the document was drafted. We got 22 organisations nationally to sign up to that document, critically including the police and local government representatives nationally. And we then decided that, I should incidentally say that within the document, there were some very clear statements about committing to work together, but also some specific individual commitments. For example, to reduce the use of police cells by 50% by 2015, and to end the use of police cars to take people into hospital in the middle of a mental health crisis. Those are just two examples. But we decided ultimately that if we just produced that document with everyone signing up to it, the risk was that it just sat on a shelf. We wanted something to happen at a local level everywhere across the country. So we embarked on a project to make that happen. And at that point, I hand over to Sophie, because Sophie played an absolutely brilliant role in helping to drive this forward. And I think it was a great example of a very constructive collaboration between third sector and government, without third sector losing its independence. But we collaborated effectively together to make something exciting happen. Over to you, Sophie.
Yeah, over to me in the talk, but also that's when it came over to me in real life, because we'd done the sort of national work and people had signed up, and it had been genuinely cross-sector. So there was ambulance, police, accident and emergency services, so the physical health services, mental health services, everybody around the table, but at a national level. So we wanted to roll it out at the local level, and it was felt that this shouldn't be driven by health, because there was a sort of territorial issue here, that this needed to be genuinely cross-sector, and so it needed effectively to be hosted by somebody that was none of those people. So we came in as a sort of honest broker and were asked to set up a project. And we worked quite closely with the Department of Health on what that should be in the framework of that. So there were some things that we knew. We knew that at a local level, we had to have the same people signing up and around the table and making things happen. So a requirement was that at a local level, we would have all of those people around the table and signing up. They had to produce a declaration, exactly the same declaration as happened nationally. And they had to, and we gave them 6 months pretty much to do that. And then they had just an extra 3 months to turn that into an action plan, because we did recognise that getting people around the table was the difficult bit. And indeed, that is what it proved. Producing the action plan turned out to be very easy. And then as the project went on, it started off as a year, and then it was extended eventually to 2.5 years. They had to do progress reports and refresh the action plan. And, as things went down, more was required of them. And they also had quite a lot of freedom. So we didn't specify what the geography was. It's very complicated in England in that all of those different agencies and authorities have very different geographies. Nothing is coterminous. So the ambulance authority would be very big. The clinical commissioning group could be, which is the group that effectively buys the healthcare locally, is very small. The local authorities are again different. The police are different. The mental health system is different from the physical health system. It was a bit of a dog's breakfast in terms of the structure, but we said you build it as you like. So in other words, whoever, you know, you could choose who would host, and they might then, the geography would be based on them. It did create a little bit of difficulty because with everyone choosing their own geographies, you did end up with some people that were left out and had to go knocking on the door to get in, but it pretty much worked, and leaving people that freedom was actually quite powerful. So we then, you know, how to make that happen, how to support it. We got ourselves a project lead, and we took on an extra worker, somebody who'd been working actually on driving the original national Concordat. And they did regional roadshows to explain stuff to people. What is it that they needed to do? How could we help them, to support them with their drafts, to encourage people in if they couldn't get people around the table, to do that sort of legwork really, and as well to broker relationships when they fell down. So people were very important. A website was very important. You wouldn't think that a website would be necessarily that important, but I am just going to, for 2 minutes, share the website with you and show you one of the reasons why it was actually so critical. So here we have the website. I hope you can all see that. Fairly basic. This is obviously archived now because this is no longer live, but it had very basic information about what the Concordat was and the National Concordat and their requirements. As time went on, it gathered good examples, and this local inspirations bit was very popular, people sending in what they were doing so that they could showcase it, but also other people looking at it. The key thing was actually this map. And as you can see, we struggled to know how to break it down because, as I said, the geographies were all, optional. But what was important about this map was that it changed colour. And I'm just going to go into Northamptonshire here very randomly. It changed colour from the points that they had their declaration statement. It went from red to amber. When they got their action plan, it went from amber to green. And then at various points when we asked them to redo their action plan, it went from green back to amber until they'd done it again, and then it went. Anyway, you'd think, well, that's very simple. So what? But it became phenomenally important to people because their line managers were watching, because the local media were watching, because their MPs were watching. Their MPs were mainly watching because we at Mind had been writing to their MPs and telling them to watch. And, they were asked onto the radio if they had gone amber or they were still red. And that just became that bit more an incentive, along with some financial incentives and other things that were around to sort of keep people moving. And we also had, alongside all of that, we had some events. So we had some problem-solving events, which people sort of opted into on some of the trickier issues. But primarily, we had 3 really big national conferences where people came to showcase and to learn and to share stories. And they were phenomenally popular. We filled them. We could have filled them twice over. And the buzz that was created around all of this, really, the media coverage, the events, people wanting to share their stuff. We had people involved who had never got involved before, A&E doctors, psychiatrists, ambulances, people all wanting to step forward. That very first meeting nationally that Norm had mentioned, really, he was asking people to step up, and they were all sort of leaning back in their chairs a little bit, waiting for somebody else. By the time the project had ended, everybody was stepping forward, wanting to get involved. So I'll hand back over to Norman for the next bit.
Yeah, and I think that ability that Sophie described to, set principles at the centre and to expect local areas to sign up to those principles that all of the key organisations had signed up to, but to give some freedom about how they should choose to implement it, became very powerful. And as we watch that map go from red to amber to green, it created this extraordinary sort of competitive spirit across the country as people began to feel very uneasy if they were a county that was still red when everything around them had turned to amber and then to green. So it built a momentum of change, which became, I think, very powerful. At the centre, we were meeting regularly to monitor this, and where there were laggards, where there were areas that weren't getting things going, we encouraged them. I wrote letters on several occasions, I think, to encourage them and to point out that others were now well ahead of them. But we built that momentum for change, which I think was very powerful. I just wanted to say something quickly about the legacy. We had set in the Concordat that we should try to reduce the use of police cells by 50% by 2015. We almost hit it. We were just short of a 50% reduction, which was an amazing reduction. Many areas reduced it by far more than that. There were some laggard counties that pulled the data back, but there was a dramatic improvement. And in turn, that led to the government deciding to legislate to ban the use of police cells for under 18s and to only allow it in really exceptional circumstances for adults. And in 2019-20, there were only 128 people ended up nationally in a police cell, adults, and only 3 under 18s. So a dramatic improvement from over 6,000. There was also a big investment in what we call health-based place of safety. So instead of people ending up in a police cell, they ended up in a proper place, in a hospital, where they would get the appropriate support. Crisis lines, this is helplines for people to ring when they were in crisis. At the start of all of this, people were ringing up and getting answer phone messages, for goodness sake, in the middle of the night. Not much use when you're in the middle of a mental health crisis. There has been a significant improvement, still not as good as it should be. When the pandemic arrived, actually, the momentum massively improved and we got to a much better place. We have managed to significantly reduce, but not eradicate, what we call out of area placements. This is people in a crisis being sent to a hospital bed away from their home area, a wholly unacceptable practice. We've managed to dramatically increase the number of crisis houses and crisis cafes. These are places for people in crisis to avoid the need for them to be admitted to hospital, so that it all helps in deinstitutionalizing mental health problems. We've managed to reduce the use of police vehicles, but again, we fall short of where we should be. But there is a clear national plan now to invest in alternative vehicles that can take people to hospital in the middle of a crisis. And we've made some progress in reducing the use of restraint, physical force in mental health settings, but we have further to go. Mind, again, acted as a brilliant point of pressure on the government and encouraged me to act to issue new guidance requiring mental health providers to very substantially reduce the use of restraint. It's still work in progress, but we are making progress on that. But I would just end by repeating that I think it created a real buzz. It really initiated collaboration, joint working on the ground in localities. People started to work together to support people in mental health crisis. It created a social movement for cooperation. And I think it's part of the story of how we've managed to reduce stigma of mental health and to give it proper equal status to physical health, albeit, again, we haven't reached our destination yet. Over to you, Sophie.
I think we're probably about out of time, actually. So perhaps I was going to come in with some reflections, Johnny, but maybe I'll save those for your questions.
That sounds great. Perfectly timed, both of you. Both of you and Shane, flawless with your timing, with such rich content, and I think Norman and Sophie, you symbolized and we're very emblematic in your comments of that third sector government partnership in the remarks you've just shared. So thanks so much. And from the messages I've seen in the chat privately and beyond, I know there's a lot of excitement around the table today as folks listening into this, with lots of people saying how timely and relevant today's conversation is for the work underway here in what's known as British Columbia. So Shane and Catherine and Norman and Sophie, if you all put your cameras on now, we're just going to have 10 to 12 minutes or so, maybe a bit longer, of a couple of questions from me that you're primed upon. And we've had some questions come in that I'll also pose from our audience today. This is a cue for people listening in that once we've finished a little bit of moderated dialogue, if you do want to take the mic or press your button, you can have that opportunity. I'm going to just linger, Norman and Sophie, with a question for you, and then I'm going to pose the same to Catherine and Shane in a second. You've described so many levers in your joining up of services, getting people to work together, making change. Norman, the stats you read out there are very compelling, you know, from 6,000 to, I think you said 128 over that time period. Norman and Sophie, and whoever wants to go first, of all of the levers you've described, what would you say was the most powerful in service of that joined up and collective impact around crisis care in the UK?
Well, I would say quickly, and then I'll hand over to Sophie, that I think it was the momentum we built. I think it was this sort of peer pressure from creating this website, which allowed people to see that map, and it became a very dynamic thing, and areas were moving from red to amber to green. And I mean, there was a moment in the winter of 2000, or as we ran up to the winter in 2014, and every year in the UK, the government hands out a bit of extra money to hospitals, acute hospitals, to try to manage the winter crisis, which always happens every year in England. I don't know whether it's the same in Canada or Australia, but I said to the Secretary of State, who was my boss, the head person in the department, I want that money only to go out across the country if that area agrees to sign up to the Crisis Care Concordat. I think it was President Johnson in the States who said, grab them by the balls and their hearts and minds will follow. There was a degree of, clear encouragement there that they would only get their money for their winter crisis if they actually took mental health seriously, as well as physical health. And that in itself, I think, was emblematic of the campaign to fight for equality for mental health as against physical health. And it forced areas to think differently to what they had ever done before about actually preparing to support people properly with mental health problems. But Sophie, what do you want to add?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to pull out one thing, because I think it was actually the combination of all of those things: the requirements, the freedoms, the shaming with the map, the incentives, the buzz. But I'd pull out just a couple of things. I think one of them was that the Concordat started with these I statements, and people were required to have people with lived experience involved in what they were doing. That was a requirement, which some of them were very reluctant to do and had to be persuaded on. And I think getting the people around the table as well, once they'd opted in, and the sort of freedom of it allowed them to opt in much more sort of commitment, offering their commitment rather than just, ticking the boxes. I think it actually plugged in to some of the reasons why people had joined these organisations in the first place, whether it was the police or the ambulance service or mental health, because they actually wanted to do what this was asking them to do. And many of them had really lost sight of that. They were working in very underfunded, really run down, horrible settings with broken windows.
Gave them permission, didn't it?
Yeah, and it just made them think, gosh, maybe the service that I'm running could be great. And actually they began to see changes. And I think as they began to recapture the vision of what that service could be, I think people just wanted to get involved.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, we ended up with some very inspiring leaders in the police force, actually, who really helped to drive the change in a way that I hadn't expected, but was very impressive.
That's excellent, both of you, to give the myriad of levers, and really arguably the collective power of those levers is what's yielded the change. And moving over to Catherine and Shane, just given what you've heard from Norman and Sophie here, within the work within MACNI, and I know there's a legislative force there, so you've actually, much like in the UK, legislation has been drafted and driven to bring about the changes that you've described. But were there any other levers, and maybe we'll go to you, Catherine, that have compelled that work to break down those silos that Shane was going through earlier?
I think one of the really great benefits to MACNI is it's not a crisis service. It's a really considered, planned response, which allows us to get that, as Shane was saying, we've got that lengthy assessment process, which not only talks about the client itself and can hopefully fill some gaps in terms of some undiagnosed mental health or disability, but it also analyses gaps within the service system, and also talks about, you know, how our system can be better integrated, whether that's through shared risk management, shared care planning, but to have that that time, I suppose. We've got that luxury of time whereas you know, other services that are sort of primarily that day-to-day crisis management, we are able to get that really detailed assessment to ensure that our responses are very considered, very planned, and it's based on that really 360-degree view of review. I think as well, and it's sort of relates to the same point, MACNI is coordination. It's not case management. So even though we do have those day-to-day crises, it allows us to still engage with, you know, engage across those silos, have those separate meetings outside of those day-to-day care team meetings, and ensure that we are really continuing to progress despite there being some day-to-day crisis. It ensures that there is still that greater plan, and that, you know, over time we can still achieve progress. Shane, I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything else.
Do you want to add anything, Shane, there? And I'll go back to you, Catherine, with a question that's come from the audience. Shane, would you add anything there?
Yeah, look, I think one of the things that makes MACNI work, I think, is the whole package of MACNI. So it's everything about MACNI that makes it work. And you can't, you know, it doesn't operate without all those intertwined sort of pieces. So whether it be the information sharing, the coordination, the governance, it's all needed. The other thing is, as I said earlier, it's a voluntary program, and I'm a firm believer in there's no point trying to force somebody to do something they don't want to do. So it's how do you structure your conversations with the clients to try and get them to engage and see the benefits of engaging, and that's a slow process at times. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, there's so much about what both Catherine, you and Shane have described that lines up with actually something that's sitting as a mandate priority for our standalone Ministry of Mental Health here in the province around creating tables. I mean, they're being framed as situation tables here, and I think there's a bit of a different flavor to what you've done in Australia there around information sharing, that voluntary care that you've described there, Shane, moving away from crisis care and case management to coordination. Catherine, a question that's come in from the audience is, you know, imagine I'm one of your clients and I hear about MACNI, which I keep thinking about macaroni whenever I hear you say MACNI, but I hear about MACNI, and I wonder in a minute or two, Catherine, if you could describe, you know, what that looks on the ground. What experiences would I have as an individual client encountering the MACNI service?
So as a client, and Shane and I have talked about the care plan coordinators. So in terms of a client's experience, it might be that their experience day to day doesn't look significantly different. The intention is to not try to introduce a new swathe of people for them to meet, because it is like people might just be saying, well, who are you? Like, what do you do? So it's about trying to foster those existing relationships. But then in terms of the care plan coordination, it's about doing some more kind of back of house work to ensure that they are sharing information, we're all on the same page, and that the services that are involved are actually complementing each other. So it could be that in terms of the services that the client directly engages with, it could be quite minimum. And the idea is to, again, foster those key connections and really have those allies for clients to engage with. And then it's a matter of feeding back certain information to the care team, which is then most relevant. We at times we'll also have clients participate in their own care teams as well. So it might be that they're there for the duration of the care team meeting. Quite often they'll only just come in towards the end, or the client might choose to pose some questions to the care team through their key worker. That's really, again, up to how the client wants to participate. So yeah, it's a very tailored individual experience, and it's very much about minimizing distress and maximizing relationships for the client. And it's certainly about reviewing their goals and what they want to achieve.
Switching gears, and you might know that hopefully you don't get seasick. I'm going to kind of go from the individual to macro a little bit, and I'm going to go to politics here, and recognizing, Norman, you're a former minister, and that comes with unique privileges and challenges and opportunities. I've mashed together my question and an audience question, which has really been about the kind of the politics of this. So it's a twofold piece, and we'll likely go to Macni with it too. Is across government, what was most powerful in getting that kind of cross well, what's your best advice? Actually, it's not what's most powerful. What's your best advice on bringing disparate government actors to the table, Norman and Sophie, in service of your work? And did you experience any political pushback, and how did you remedy that? Short of Norman sending angry letters, as he skillfully does, to be persuasive. What did that look like around mobilizing the behemoth of the government in the UK, and how did you deal with political pushback, both of you?
Well, it was interesting that at the time this was a coalition government, which is not the usual thing in the United Kingdom. This was a coalition between Liberal Democrats, which I guess are somewhere between your Liberal Party and your, what is the Democratic?
Oh, the NDP,
Party?
the NDP, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But sort of centre-left, I guess, we would be described as. I was a Liberal Democrat. But actually on this issue, the Home Secretary, who was in charge of the Home Office, in other words, responsible for the police force, was one Theresa May, who became the Prime Minister. And actually, to give her credit, she got this, and she was committed to improving crisis care and to reducing, for example, the use of police cells. She saw it as unacceptable. So there was a good collaboration between the two parties in order to make this happen. I got no pushback at all from the Home Office. We led on it, we drove it, but the Home Office cooperated completely. I think since then, I would just add that, for me, the focus has to now become to drive the case for a human rights-based mental health approach, progressive mental health care. By that I mean deinstitutionalizing mental health services, supporting people in the community, avoiding crises as much as possible, but also recognizing that crises will happen, and that when crises do happen, there must be an effective response to it. And that's what this Concordat was designed to do. And I was very pleased that about 3 weeks ago, the World Health Organization issued new guidance. I chaired the first half of the launch event, but this is new guidance on how you deliver a human rights-based, person-centered, community-based mental health approach. And I think it's brilliant that on a global basis, the World Health Organization is showing a lead in making the case for respecting people's human rights and treating people as equal citizens, which is not what has always happened in mental health care in the past. And in my view, in our country, in England and in the United Kingdom, we still too often breach people's human rights. We detain far too many people under the Mental Health Act. We still use force too often. And so we've got a long way to go. But in my organisation at the South London Maudsley, I'm trying to push for us to champion that human rights-based approach to mental health care.
Thank you, Norm. Sophie, would you add anything there?
Yeah, I would just add one thing. I think it was very interesting at the time because the Secretary of State, Norman's boss, who he refers to, who is Conservative, at the time didn't appear to be interested in mental health at all. And I think as a result of that, basically, am I right, Norman, just said, okay, you get on with it.
He let me get on with it. Yeah.
So there was no political issue because there was no political interest. This changed during the period of the Concordat, and by the time we got to the third national meeting, the Secretary of State was coming and speaking to the national meeting, and part of that was the momentum around it, and part of it was that crisis work, which is so good for the media. You know, we had policemen tweeting that they had a child in a police cell because no mental health service had a bed. And that got that really got the ear of the media and of the public, and therefore of the politicians. So I think it was that began, and I see actually crisis care as a wedge, you know, from our point of view as an organisation, to get a country interested in mental health, because the issues are so obvious. And I think it was that almost that created the political momentum. And in fact, since then, pretty much in the UK, there's been pretty much consensus around mental health politically.
The Conservatives wanted to be part of the success of it.
Yeah,
absolutely. We've had a flurry of questions coming in, and we'll definitely go to an open mic shortly. But just to pick up one question that's come in for the MACNI group, and this builds nicely on Norman's and Sophie's response, was the legislation that you described. Was that kind of driven by elected officials there, or was it driven by the bureaucracy, the civil service there? And how long did it take from the genesis of the idea, Catherine and Shane, until it was realized there? Could you shed some light on that for our audience?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Look, I think it was driven broadly through in about 2000, a series of events happened where we were getting a lot of media attention about a small group of complex clients who were just not getting access to services. So that was in about 2000. I think by 2002, so I think it took about 2 years of working through to have the legislation ready to go to Parliament. So I think it might have been 2003 the legislation actually came through. So fairly quick. Who was it driven by? I think it was driven by, before my time, but I'm pretty sure it was driven by both sides of government were very supportive of something needed to be done. And it had a lot of interest from the departments, the different government departments. So very much a consensus approach, I think, driven to close the gaps and stop people falling through these cracks and ending up, I think, as you know, Norman says, in police cells when they shouldn't have been, or hospital beds when they shouldn't have been there. So yeah.
Well, thank you for that. And this might be a question for Catherine. It comes from Lindsay Lord, who's put it publicly in the chat, who's very connected to justice system work and justice diversion, listening in on the call today. And question specifically for the MACNI team around how your program dovetails over to individuals with complex needs who are often ensnared or in conflict with the law or involved in the criminal justice system. And I think the nub of Lindsay's question is do you have data, qualitative, quantitative, that would indicate your program has led to diversion away from the formal justice system?
We do have a great data system. I would have to go into detail in terms of telling that story. It probably is a bit more qualitative, but we could certainly go back and look at data in more detail over the last couple of years. Part of MACNI's involvement can also be around key transitions. So it's not unusual for us to receive referrals from prisons directly. We also have clients that may be on disability justice orders, whether they're custodial or non-custodial. So again, the goal for justice clients can vary greatly. Sometimes it can be about getting them out into the community. For some clients, we find that for a various array of reasons, they often seem to seek the containment and predictability of a cell, and for them, it's the safest place. So those clients can, in particular, be very difficult to work with. We often, and unfortunately, get people who can be on that revolving door of remand, where within a number of days of being released, that they may be conducting relatively minor offences, but then find themselves back on remand. Nonetheless, I think that legislation is there to I suppose, allow that sharing of information, and to again allow that shared care planning, that sense of shared risk assessment and then risk management as well. Whether it's working with the sentence management branch or it's about working through the court system to try and identify the most appropriate accommodation. Yeah, it's, I guess, the management of clients who have that justice intersection is no different. It's simply another silo for us to try and break into. Shane, do you have anything else to add?
No, I think you've answered that one.
Well, that's brilliant. And I think on this notion of diversion, and I'm going to go to Sophie and Norman next. Questions came up to me directly here with regard to the crisis care Concordat. I mean, there's a very robust dialogue happening globally, North America, Canada, provincially here, around the role of policing in interactions with folks who are in a mental health crisis, or perhaps in a situation that have attracted police attention and there's a mental health crisis component. And so there's quite a lot of work underway here around, in partnership with the police and others, around expanding the crisis care continuum. And the question that's come in here is has the crisis care Concordat, I mean, you've demonstrated great stats around keeping people out of police cells and what have you. Would you, if a chief of police was on the phone listening in here and we invited him or her to comment, would they say that it's the crisis care Concordat's helped with that diversion activity? Would you say police time is being better deployed for traditional policing activities, crime prevention, public safety, as a result of the crisis care Concordat? Does that question make sense, Sophie, Norman?
Yes, it does. And I would say yes and no. Yes, in that they aren't taking people to custody suites and into police cells to wait, so they are being able to take people to places of safety, but they are, and I'm still involved in one of the groups with the Home Office around policing. They are, I couldn't tell you a quantum as to whether it's more or less or about the same, but they are hugely involved still, and particularly around the pandemic, they will have said that the quantity of call-outs, which are mental health related, is huge. They have absolutely accepted that mental health is police business, but I think they would have very good arguments, which I think everybody would agree with, that many of the people that they're dealing with shouldn't have got to the state that the police have been involved. You know, other services should have been there and should have picked up. And also we have quite a lot of difficulties with handovers, so the police pick them up under certain legislation they've got around the mental health legislation, and then they're supposed to take them if necessary to A&E or to a mental health setting, and then handover because of bed shortages or because of A&E queues is problematic. And so we end up with police episodes of restraint that can end in death, unfortunately, in similar ways as we've seen in other countries, and police time sort of very much caught up, and all the other attendant problems of, is the training for police good enough, and all of that sort of thing.
Yeah, we absolutely haven't solved the problem completely by any stretch of the imagination, and sometimes the fate of people picked up by the police, often because they don't have sufficient training, is not acceptable. There was a case featured on national television on our Panorama, BBC Panorama programme recently, of a man called Kevin Clark, who died after police restraint. I mean, it was horribly similar to the horrors of the United States, with the man saying he couldn't breathe, and everything filmed on the police body cams. So, you know, there is a lot of mental ill health in our society and an inadequate response to it. What we managed to do was to get much better liaison, much better joint working, and achieve some key improvements, but absolutely we have not solved the problem. And you know, my argument is that going back to what I said earlier about the WHO, we spend too big a proportion of our budget on containing people in beds in institutions, and not enough in preventing mental ill health in the first place, preventing people falling into crisis. And that's why we need this decisive cultural shift towards a human rights-based approach. I think Mary Morrison, is it, who's taking part today, asked about how you get hold of the WHO guidance. Well, I just Googled WHO guidance mental health, and it comes up. So you should be able to find it very easily online.
Thanks so much. Thank you. I'm just going to give a 3-minute warning for our audience if anyone would like to unmic, and so we'll just reserve 3 minutes for this next question, and just to see if there's any live interaction from our listeners here. This is a very technical question, but it's one that comes up time and time again, and actually here provincially, the province is doing a review of its statutes related to privacy and information sharing. A long-held critique of legislation here has been that health wasn't in mind when these pieces of legislation were drafted, and so we have all of the challenges of information not being shared, and many agencies, I think, of course, also signal concern around having health information show up on police databases and all of those complexities. It sounds like with MACNI, you cracked the nut of privacy and information sharing and consent-driven pieces around those tables. Would I be accurate in saying you cracked that nut and problem solved, and you know, waved a wand, and there was good there where consumer groups were happy, legislators were happy, civil rights groups were happy? Would that be a fair assessment, Shane, Catherine?
Yeah, look, I think globally the answer is yes. There are issues. So, look, certainly for the formal MACNI, when consent by the client is given, information can be shared readily. It's still got the constraints around, it's still in the best interests of the client, and all those sort of things come into play. Occasionally we have hospitals, so a client might be on a mental health ward in a hospital, and they're refusing to share information and telling us to go under FOI. But once it boils down to it, the legislation allows the sharing of information, it doesn't compel. And so it comes down to communication most of the time. Just if you go in with a big stick and say to a hospital, you must give me the information, you don't seem to get anywhere. If you explain to them and they're a partner, and especially if their hospital exec are on our area-based complex needs panels, you've already got senior executive management that understands MACNI. And so it's just a phone call to them to say, hey, we're wanting this information, can you? And they go, oh, yeah, of course you can. And you get it within days. But so it's fairly good, not perfect, but fairly good.
Thank you. That's great. Well, why don't we just roll the dice here a little and see if any of our participants here. I've got two final questions to close things out before I hand things back to Alan. But anyone listening in here who wants to unmute, raise a hand, unmute, and pose a question before I go back to some of the ones that have been sent in through text. So just opening the floor for a little minute here. Let's see what happens. Maybe this is a reflection of people feeling comfy with their questions coming in and getting.
See, Alan's hand is up.
Alan, there's Dr. Castle there. Over to you, Alan.
Thanks, Johnny. I had a question about the Concordat. Now, a very fascinating conversation, because the Concordat very clearly about crisis response, right? The McNee approach is much more. It's actually in Covey's top right box, sort of important but not urgent. Doing that sort of longer haul work to make, to knit pieces together. Back to the Concordat, is there some connection beyond the crisis response piece to what you might call more sustaining sort of supports and services? Once the crisis has been attended to, is there also linkage into something which is more sustainable over time for that person? Has that connection been made as it's evolved?
Well, one thing just to say very quickly, the Concordat that everyone signed up to specifically said that we commit to working together to prevent people falling into crisis in the first place. Now, I don't think we have solved that in any shape or form, but the commitment was there. But what I think has happened alongside the work we did was other initiatives. There's a long-term plan for the NHS which commits to extra investment in mental health. At the moment, in my trust in South East London, we're getting significant extra money, to be fair to the government, for developing our community support for people to help prevent people falling into crisis and needing a hospital admission. But this is a journey we're on, and I think we've made progress in the last decade in confronting the stigma of mental ill health, in building public awareness and improving coordination, but we've got a hell of a long way still to go. Sophie?
Yeah, the original Concordat had 4 sections. So it was before a crisis. So when people are approaching crisis, their need for informal services, in a crisis, and how you're routing, then the quality of crisis care, because inpatient care is still not always that good. And then it was afterwards, which was about how to support somebody after a crisis and to make sure that that crisis wasn't repeated. Inevitably, most of the focus of most of the groups was on that second stage, because that's a lot of the energy for this came from the police, and that's where they were interested. And a lot of the secondary stages were the mental health services responsibility, and they felt overwhelmed and didn't engage there. But we now have changes to the Mental Health Act, which is shifting some of that, but also this big initiative. So the Concordat was eventually wrapped up into the 5-year forward view, which was then wrapped up into the 10-year long-term plan. And by 2022-23, we've got a commitment to be spending £1 billion a year on community services, which is very widely defined to include all sorts of voluntary sector things and debt advice and all sorts. So that there has been this movement, but it has been a slow old process. But I think my personal view is that starting with crisis was how to get everybody interested, because debt advice and voluntary sector services don't sound very exciting to most people.
Alan, you got to follow it.
Yeah, if I could just continue on that. I mean, one of the frustrations for police in this country is that when things really go off the rails in a crisis response, they become the lightning rod for everything bad that has happened. And as they rightly point out, and as I think Norman just said, it was often other links in the chain too, which have contributed to this piece. Are there particular champions in the UK police forces that have made a real difference in terms of the police contribution to this? That for instance, we might reach out to if we wanted to construct a dialogue around this here.
There were brilliant champions at the time. The national lead on mental health in the police, the lead in the Metropolitan Police, were fantastic, inspirational champions of a more enlightened approach to the police. I'm not sure that we've maintained the momentum in the police at the moment, but Sophie, you might have a better handle on that at the moment. I still see too many problems in the Metropolitan Police in our dealings with them. but that experience might be different elsewhere.
Yeah, I think there are still some good people around, and some of the people that we were working with in the Met have moved across and now more senior in, I think, the West Midlands force, and there are some people around, including police and crime commissioners who are really interested in this. So, but it hasn't got the level of profile, I think, that it had within the police. So they've moved back, I think, to more of a just trying to get things done process rather than trying to get things, you know, move things on in the more visionary way that they were.
Perfect. We're in the home stretch here, and so I'm going to do a 2-for-1 deal with a mashup between a couple of audience submitted questions here, and so you can choose. You don't have to answer both parts. You can pick A or B, and we'll go through. We'll start with Mackie and then move to the UK. So the question is here: in hindsight, what is one thing that you wished you could have done differently, or wish could be done differently around your sphere of work, or looking ahead at the lifespan of the work you're leading, you know, where is one area of impact that you really want to have going forward within the context of your work? And I wonder if we could start with you, Catherine, and then go to Shane, either or something you'd wish you'd done differently or something you really want to drive change going forward with. Catherine.
I think, and Shane did touch on this before, I think for us, a big area of improvement is that sector capacity building. And again, there is, unfortunately in our society, it's a real risk averse environment out there. So people often, you know, they don't want to work with these clients because they're too difficult, or so for us it's about doing some reflective practice and integrating that into our regular care team meetings, discussing it at panel, trying to support all of the care team as a whole. You know, we often experience a lot of burnout with some of these cases. So it is incredibly difficult, and we want to maintain that consistency of staff. So I think trying to invest in our sector is really, really important, and it's something that it is going to be expensive, but I think it's something that if we can put that investment in from the outset, and then get those organisations to really take that on themselves, and then have that internal process as well. I think that it'll be, I suppose, short-term pain, long-term gain, I'm hoping. I think the other thing for us, which is another area of improvement, is around that cultural safety. So not just for Aboriginal clients, but Victoria and Melbourne in particular is incredibly multicultural. So I think rather than using generic templates and processes for everyone, I think it'd be great for us to look more introspectively in terms of how can we tailor this process a little bit more? How can we modify things a little bit to make them a bit more culturally safe?
Thank you so much, Catherine, and thanks for all you've shared today. Shane, a lessons learned or a goal for the future?
Look, I think the lessons learned continue to review all the time, continuous improvement. And I think, you know, when people say, what will we do different? If you read the 2013 version of our policy to that 2020, you'll see the changes as we continually try and improve our services. The work we've done with the local complex needs panels and the membership there. I thought one of the interesting things about England, you know, here we got an email from a police sergeant saying since a client picked up Macnie, their workload had dropped 50% at that station because they weren't involved on a daily basis with that client. We're now getting. I went to a panel the other day that had 3 policemen in attendance for the 2 hours of the panel because there was a couple of clients that are of interest to them, and that, you know, so it's this working in partnership with them so they don't pick them up and put them in a police car and take them to their cell, that they having coffee with the police, you know, at a local housing estate, you know, occasionally, just trying to break down those barriers. So, and the last thing I think we've done is we doubled the number of departmental staff complex needs coordinators in those 17 geographical areas about 2 years ago. it is about coordination and early intervention. So this concept of trying to divert before things go to a state that they need a formal MACNI response.
That's great. Thank you so much, Shane. And with our remaining few minutes here, we're going to go to Sophie and then Norman. Lessons learned or a big whomping impact you want to have going forward, Sophie?
Well, there's more than one thing going forward. I'll go for the going forward, looking forward, Johnny. But if you were to focus on crisis care, I think this was what was in our very, very first report, the one that Norman talked about that we did in 2011 on this, which was based on talking to people over a year of their experiences of crisis care. And the biggest thing they said was missing was humanity in terms of the services, that they would be very vulnerable in crisis, absolutely in their hour of need, and services were harsh and unfriendly and unlistening, and actually to build humanity back into that. And some of that is about tapping in to the humanity that people bring to work when they start and sort of lose as they go along. So helping people in services to get back that feeling of being able to give to people, so that services are welcoming, treat people as guests, feel good places to be.
Well, and Sophie, we actually use some of the first-hand testimony from mine in your crisis care review work in our testimony here to the special committee that's looking to reform the police act here, and very powerful, those first-hand narratives of what you'd expect to be different in the crisis care you receive. So thanks so much, Sophie, for articulating and crisis care being a wedge that can really drive some change going forward, including prevention and early intervention. Norman, last response from you.
Okay, well, if I was doing it today, it should confront the race dimension of mental health care and of policing, and it didn't sufficiently. There are still disturbing cases, too many of them. There was the Kevin Clark case I referred to, which was featured on television. Last week, a police officer was sentenced, or this week, a police officer was sentenced to 8 years in prison for manslaughter following the death of a former Premier League footballer, a black Premier League footballer, who experienced a psychotic episode and was tasered and then kicked on the ground on the head. Shameful act by that officer. But these things happen too often. And if you are a young black man, you're far more likely to be detained under our Mental Health Act than if you're a white young man. That's intolerable. But I think many countries face this same structural racism, and it has to be confronted. The final thing I would say, which is related, is that, I repeat what I said earlier, I'm on a mission to fight for human rights-based, modern, progressive mental health care that focuses on people and enabling people to live good lives, happy lives as far as possible, rather than detaining too many people and containing them in institutions, which does nothing to give them opportunity that the rest of us take for granted. So I think there is a global campaign that has to still be fought for the rights of people with mental ill health to be treated as equal citizens. In too many countries, they still face discrimination inbuilt in the law, affecting your right to marry, your right to own property, your right to enter a contract. So this is a human rights campaign that has to be fought globally for the rights of people with mental ill health.
Norman, great words to conclude on. Before I hand things back to Alan here, a heartfelt thank you from me for all of your engagement, your expertise, your contributions. Catherine and Shane, Sophie and Norman, thank you so very much. Over to you, Alan.
Thanks very much, Johnny. And very quickly, first of all, a profound thank you to all of our presenters who, despite the challenges of time zones, geography, and everything else that was required in bringing something like this together, I think provided us with a wonderful overview. We couldn't have asked for more, and thank you all individually very, very much. As someone just said, it's an amazing session. Thanks also to Johnny for your facilitation, wonderful as ever. Thank you to the John Howard Society for continuing to sponsor this series of discussions. And a reminder that our next event is going to be on September the 29th at 11 a.m. And we're going to look this time a little more domestically at North American models of this kind of alignment. So thank you all, and stay well, stay cool or warm, depending where you are. Thank you.
I think a little too warm in Canada.
A little has been, yes. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you all.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.